Welcome back. This video I'm going to walk you through some ideas from a paper that I wrote quite some time ago. It's a bit dated now, about 20 years ago, but it's a paper that appeared in a journal called the Journal of Theoretical Medicine and Bioethics, and it's a paper about cloning, and specifically spare parts, what's called spare parts cloning. And what I'm trying to think about is what are the ethics involved with intentionally creating other human beings to use for spare parts. And I'm going to draw on the philosophy of Aristotle to try and see what he thinks about cloning. So you may know how to ball, but I know Aristotle too. You may know how to sing, make money in big concerts, but I know Aristotle too. Some of you might understand that reference. Okay, so in 1997, scientists created a headless frog in an embryo headless frog in a laboratory. This was in the late 90s. The article stated that British scientists had been able to manipulate the genetic structure of a frog embryo so to prohibit the growth of the frog's head. So it was a headless frog. The article made guesses at how this technique might be used to clone genetically identical headless humans for organ transplants. So the idea is you could maybe when you come into being, or you're born, your parents could simultaneously clone you and have a spare parts embryo in the lab. Maybe they could grow it to a full organism, so that when you get sick later on in life, you could have a spare parts clone. Such headless, I think there's a movie called The Island, I think, that dealt with this same topic, but these weren't headless clones, these were just clones. So a headless clone would be without a brain and nervous system, may not even qualify as an embryo, according to the article. Now, if that's true, such headless clones would not be human embryos. Experimentation on them or harvesting them of organs would not involve harming a human embryo, according to this view. Even advocates of a strong view of personhood wouldn't complain that any human being at any embryonic stage would be harmed if its organs were harvested. The task of this paper, in other words, what I'm going to argue in this paper, is to show the implication that Aristotle's view of the soul, if true, would have a specific response to the ethics of headless spare parts cloning. So I want to try and answer four questions. Would Aristotle believe that clones have souls? And would Aristotle believe that headless human clones would have souls? And thirdly, would Aristotle believe that headless spare parts cloning is virtuous? Right? Does it fall within the scope of his virtue ethics? And then, is Aristotle's metaphysics of soul and ethics, which follow from it, plausible? Is it rationally defensible? I'm going to argue that it, in fact, is. So first puzzle: do clones have souls? Do clones have souls? So the first puzzle for an Aristotelian account of the metaphysics of headless clones is the ontological status of clones. A human being as a biological organism is a substance, composite entity of matter and form, or body and soul. The key element of this composite for the purposes of this paper is the soul. The soul makes the matter to which it is connected into a specific kind of matter. In this case here, the soul makes the human body to be a particular kind of primate. In broad terms, the soul, according to Aristotle, is, quote, a substance in the sense of the form of a natural body, having life potentially within it. Or put it in another way, a soul is a substance in which the sense which corresponds to the account of a thing is what it is to be for a body of the character just assigned. That's Aristotle's view. If this is what the soul is, this definition will be elaborated below. The question is, how do human beings come to have their souls? It seems to me that Aristotle believed that the soul branches off or is propagated by the organism's parents. Sometimes this is called traducianism, branching. If this is correct, then clones, which are simply Latter-day twins, this is different than Latter-day Saints, though I guess you could believe in Latter-day Saints and believe that Latter-day twins are Latter-day Saints. Something like that. It's a weird mix of ideas there. But they would come to have their souls in the same way that identical twins would have their souls, right? Nobody usually worries that, oh wow, we have identical twins, which one has the soul? right? So if clones are Latter-day twins, then they have their souls in the same way that ordinary twins have their souls, assuming identical twins have souls. Through the totipotentiality of each cell, clones, like Latter-day twins, obtain their souls from their parents of the cloned organism. In Aristotle's work, The Generation of Animals, he states, as no part of the body, if it participate not in the soul, will be a part except homonymously, as the eye of a dead man is still called an eye, so no soul will exist in anything except that which it is a soul. It is plain, therefore, that semen, for example, both has soul and is soul potentially. This would relate to cloning by somatic cell nuclear transfer in the following ways. The nucleus of a somatic cell, which is removed for implementation into an egg, maybe a donor egg, could be, I suppose, the same organism's egg, ceases to be a nucleus of that cell. It is one only homonymously, that is by name only. This has the same name. It has soul or is soul now only potentially. A new soul comes into being when the chemical electro reaction for stimulating the nucleus of a new cell is complete. This is not an extensive description of the process of somatic cell nuclear transfer of cloning. It's a rather rough and ready description. I think it's beyond my ability to go into all the details of that. The soul of the clone comes into being at the time of artificial conception, so call that quote-unquote artificial conception. Like conception was done artificially, right? So at artificial conception, the soul of the cloned organism comes into being just as the new soul of a regular embryo comes into being at the time of natural conception. So I think that Aristotle would maintain that the clones would have souls and that they are passed on to them by the parents of the organism being cloned, that they come into being at the time of artificial conception. So now the question is, are headless clones human? One might think that a headless clone doesn't have a soul because it just isn't the same kind of organism as the full-headed organism. There are humans, which are one kind of thing, and then there are headless humans, or we could call them ichabodies. That's not my reference there. It's a term cloned by another philosopher. Let me see if I can get that reference for you. This is not. I'd like to take credit for that neologism, but unfortunately it is not mine. But let me give you that reference here. I can find this reference number 5 here at the end of the document. Let me see if I can dig that reference up for you. Where is it? Number 5. Yeah, it's from Peter Steeves, S-T-E-E-V-E-S, in a article called Ichabodies in an online journal called Conscious Choice from the early 2000s, October 2003. So Reeves's neologism of Ichabodies. The reference is after Ichabod Crane, the Sleepy Hollow legend, headless horseman, and Ichabodi. It just sounds funny because ick sounds like icky, right? I suppose a headless clone would be a little icky, but it's Ichabod, not icky in the sense of like gross or something. So, okay. So are headless clones human? Well, these Ichabodies would, I think Aristotle would maintain, have souls. Ichabodies have souls and are the same kinds of beings as full-headed human beings, non-Ichabodies. Suppose I'm one of them and so are you. Aristotle might argue for this view through his account of potentiality and actuality. Now, this is an important metaphysical distinction, I think, that runs right through Aristotle's De Anima, as well as his other works, and I think it's a metaphysical notion that philosophers today should still maintain. One kind of potentiality for Aristotle is the principle of change in the very subject that is affected, causing the subject to be affected by the agency of another thing. Okay, that's one kind of potentiality. It's quoting Aristotle there. It's the potentiality the thing has to be subjected to change by something outside of itself. This is the kind of potentiality that is had by artifacts. I suppose it could be had by an organism. For example, I have the potentiality to be shark food. If I get eaten by a shark, I'm Tim no more. I am shark parts, at least my body is. The second kind of potentiality is the potentiality the thing has to change itself, change within itself. And it has only, this is had only by substances or souls. When individual members of natural kinds, beings with souls, act, they do so as both patient and agent. They fully have potentiality in both senses. Now, once Aristotle establishes the concept of potentiality in natural kinds, he moves on to show the absurdities of thinking that a natural kind cannot have a property in a potential way. He shows the absurdities of thinking that an object cannot have a property unless it's now having that property. Okay, there's an absurdity in that. He argues by analogy, using the example of a builder. One could claim that a builder is only a builder as long as he's building, and doesn't have the art of building when he ceases to build. So the art is gained and lost, etc. Now this view is absurd. According to Aristotle, he states that if that which is deprived of potentiality is incapable, that which is now happening will be incapable of happening. But he who says of that which is incapable of happening that it is or will say what is untrue. So if something is to have a certain property, necessarily it will have that property in a certain mode of potentiality before it is had in an actual mode. This seems like a metaphysical necessity to me, at least for organisms or substances. Aristotle makes this a little clearer when he says, quote, "A thing is capable of doing something if there's nothing impossible in its having the actuality of that which it is said to have the capacity." I take capacity here roughly to be synonymous with potentiality. Though Aristotle does not explicitly set up the issue in this way, it is consistent with his ideas of potentiality to say that when a member of a natural kind has a potentiality, what it has is an instance of a property in a certain sort of mode, the mode of potentiality. This differs from having an instance of a property in actuality, not in virtue of whether or not the property is instanced in the subject, but rather in the mode that the property is manifest in the subject. Okay, so in other words, there's two ways that a substance, organism in this case, can have a property. They can have it in a mode of potentiality and have it in a mode of actuality. But in order to have it in a mode of actuality, it has to have it first in a mode of potentiality. Now again, by potentiality, I don't mean it has the potential to actually have that property. I mean it has the property really in the thing, but only in a certain mode, a certain manner of being. It really has it, but it has it unexpressed. Okay, so there's a distinction, and I think a lot of what I'm arguing here hinges on that distinction. Here's the beginning of an answer to the question about headless clones. A member of a natural kind, human, is capable of being a full-headed human if there's nothing impossible in its having the actuality of a full-headedness, which the human soul has the capacity. The property of being a full-headed can be present in the mode of potentiality, even if that property is not actualized at a given time. Though not actually full-headed, though the clone, even though not actually full-headed, has the property of being full-headed, even though it is had in a mode of potentiality. Perhaps it would be better to say that the clone actually has the property of having the capacity to be full-headed. In chapter 4 of Metaphysics, book 9, Theta, Aristotle spells out more precisely the nature of the relationship between a subject, a natural kind with a soul that exists, and the properties that are in potentiality had by that subject. He argues that if two things are related in this way, call this the relation of potentiality, then if one is, the other must also be. So if a subject that has a property in potentiality actually exists, then the property in potentiality must also exist. Thus for any y, if y enters into the relation of potentiality with some x, then if x exists, then y also must exist. It's a general description of what I'm asserting here. What the notion of the potentiality relation brings out is that if a subject is of such a kind that it has a property in the mode of potentiality, when the subject, i.e. the natural kind, comes to exist, then the property in the mode of potentiality also comes to exist. There's a specific relevance of the notion of the potentiality relation to the part-whole relations that are had by members of natural kinds in virtue of their souls that needs to be brought out here. And Aristotle says in Metaphysics, book 7, chapter 10, he says this, "And since the souls of animals, for this is the substance of all living beings, is their substance according to the formula, that is the form and the essence of a body of a certain kind, therefore the parts of the soul are prior, either all of them or some of them, to the concrete animal, and similarly in each case of the concrete whole, and the body and its parts are posterior to this its substance," right? So just got to think about that. The body and its parts are posterior to the substance. So the substance comes first, the body in its expression over time, over its teleological development, is after, posterior. Okay. So it seems reasonable to conclude from this that the soul of an animal is what gives the member of a natural kind, i.e. the matter, form, composite, all of its properties. Those had in the mode of potentiality and those had in the mode of actuality. The soul is both prior to the concrete animal and all its parts. Thus, through the animal's soul, the whole animal and all of its parts are fully present, even before those parts, qua potentialities, have been realized through the matter, which the soul is informing, while the body and its parts are actualized posterior to the existence of the composite substance. It would be inconsistent with Aristotle to say that the whole body and all of its parts are fully present in potentiality by means of the soul when the substance, matter-formed composite, comes to exist. Thus, if the soul exists, then a body of a certain kind with all its parts, which actually exist in a mode of potentiality, must also exist. Okay, so this is a necessary claim. Necessarily, if any substance comes into being, and that is a part-whole composite informed by an essential nature or soul, the whole, all of its qualities come into being. But some of those qualities can be had in a mode of potentiality, some of those in the mode of actuality, and necessarily anything that is in the mode of actuality was had prior in a mode of potentiality, but it was really had by that substance, that substantial unity. Aristotle does seem to give some qualification regarding the logical priority of the soul to the body. He states that there are some parts which are neither prior nor posterior to the whole, those which are most important, in which the form, the substance, is immediately present, perhaps the heart or the brain, for it does not matter which of these two has this quality. One might claim that this passage means that Aristotle does not view the soul as being absolutely prior to the body, and thus not the kind of thing that would have potentialities from within it. But this does not follow. Doesn't follow. Here's why. The context of this passage indicates that there are some physical parts of an organism in which the form or soul expresses themselves in an immediate way. Now, I think this is necessarily the case for an embodied being, right? To be an embodied being is to express the soul in certain ways necessarily for that form to exemplify itself in actuality. Okay, so Aristotle believed that these parts of the body which were such that they were not prior to the soul, no bodily parts are, nor posterior to it, unlike some parts of the body which are posterior to the soul. The emphasis here is on the non-posterior nature of some parts of the body. This doesn't mean that the soul is identical with these non-posterior parts. It simply means that some parts of the body, maybe the brain or the heart, simply come into being with the instantiation of the soul, immediately, not prior to it and not after it, but with it. This seems fairly obvious for cases of the coming into being of a new member of a particular natural kind. In order to come into being, matter must be informed with the form, but the immediately formed matter necessarily brings with it the exemplification of the soul, which is logically prior to the uninformed matter. So Aristotle simply means that the soul is logically prior to the body, and that some parts of the body come into being with neither prior nor posterior to the instantiation of the soul in matter. So this seems to strengthen the interpretation being made here regarding the unactualized presence of a head or brain of a headless clone. Soul of the cloned organism, headless or not, is the same kind of thing existing with latent capacities prior to its instantiation in matter. When it's instantiated, it's simply unable to actualize its latent potentialities in the matter it's informing. The brain cannot come into actualization cotemporarily with the soul. This doesn't imply that the soul doesn't have the capacity to inform matter in such a way so that it could express this potentiality, say counterfactually, if the parts were ordered properly, if the brain hadn't been turned off. Spinal cord, all the nervous system, whatever. It simply means that it is unable to do so given the restrictions in its matter. An application of this sort of argument to clones, the case of headless clones seems straightforward. It is the human form or the soul that is logically prior to the body, and the matter that is informed by the human form enters into the relation of potentiality with that form. There is a relationship between the human form and the material informed by the human soul that makes the parts of the human such that if some form exists in some matter, then the human body and all of its parts must also exist. All of its parts must exist. From this, it can be inferred that the individual human parts are related potentially to the human body insofar as it is a whole informed by the human soul. Thus, if a human body as a whole, understood as a whole, then exists, then all of the parts of the whole must exist. But you might say, well, the thing doesn't have a head. Okay, so, however, in the case of the headless clone, the head doesn't exist as actualized. The having of head is a property in potentiality that is had by the clone subject of that property. It is possible for the head to be actualized, and so the head does exist, but only as a potentiality in the human substance. So it really has it, It just has a certain kind of mode. The clone actually has a head in the mode of potentiality. It has a head in potentiality, not yet in actuality. Now, it gets a little tricky here, because what we don't want to say is that it has a head. It potentially has a head. No, it doesn't potentially has a head. It has a head in a mode of potentiality. So, for example, for me, if I were eaten by a shark right now, I'm potentially shark food. That is, it's possible for me to become shark food, but as long as nothing interferes with it, I never will be. It's like I don't get eaten. But this is different in the case of the headless clone. The headless clone actually has a head right now. It's just not actual. It's not actualized, but it's really there, given the nature of the human soul. So if Aristotle means that potentiality and actuality are modes of being, or modes of having a property, then a clone can have a property of having a head in actuality or in potentiality. If this is a correct analysis of Aristotle's view of potentiality and actuality as related to being, it is just the tinkering of the geneticist, that scientist, whomever, mad scientist maybe. It's the tinkering of the geneticist that prohibits one of the clone's properties that exists in potentiality from existing in actuality. To sum up, Aristotle in the Physics maintains that when a natural kind comes to be, it does so in virtue of the form. He states the shape or the form is the nature, the essence. The actuality of an informed natural kind is tied into the very being, the existence of the thing. The thing's existence just is its being this exact sort of informed matter, packed full of potentialities. The unfolding of potentialities is the actualization of what is already present. Since the source of actualization of the potentialities is in the thing itself already is and has all of its properties existing in potentiality. All these properties can move from existing in actuality given the right conditions. However, it is the actuality of the whole natural kind that is prior to the actualization of all its potentiality. What are the implications here for this question of are headless clones human? The answer is that when a human being comes to be, it becomes to be as a full member of its kind, regardless of the actualization of the potentialities that are had within it. Cloned embryo that has been genetically altered so that the head and brain function cannot be actualized would still be the same kind of thing as a non-altered embryo. So one objection here is that the brain is necessary for proper actualization of rational capacities, which according to Aristotle is an essential property of being human. Since the brain isn't actualized, rationality isn't also actualized, and so one could argue that headless embryos wouldn't be human. This might be the case if Aristotle didn't maintain the key distinction between potentiality and actuality, as discussed above. It is not the expression of rationality that makes an organism human. It is the being of the kind of thing, of organism, that has the capacity to express rational activity that makes an organism human. Headless cloned embryos are the kinds of organisms that have the capacity due to the presence of the human soul. They are fully human. A few things need to be said here about several related passages from Aristotle's De Anima. One passage relating to the soul, to the potentiality-actuality distinction, is found in Book 2 of De Anima. Here's what Aristotle says. Hence the soul must be a substance in the sense of a form of a natural body, having life potentially within it. But substance is actuality, and thus the soul is the actuality of a body. He goes on to state, for the actuality of each thing comes naturally about in that which is already potentially and in its appropriate matter. Okay, let me say that again. The actuality comes naturally about in that which is already such potentiality. Right? It's already there. It just needs to be actualized, fully expressed. From all this, it is clear that the soul is a kind of actuality and principle of that which has the potentiality to be such, of that which has it. Already has it. It's clear from these statements from Aristotle. When a soul comes to instantiate itself in some matter, the whole organism as a complete, full, actual member of its natural kind, having that particular soul, comes into being as well. He indicates that when the soul comes to be instantiated in some matter, it is the cause or source of the living body, the source of origin or movement, the end, the telos, and the essence of the whole living body. The soul causes the movement, it causes the form to actualize its latent potentials as its end. Thus, the human soul is what moves it to realize its form and is the cause of the form actualized in the body. The human that lacks a head actually has a complete human soul. this person has been kept from realizing one element of its form as exemplified in the specific aspect of its body, namely its head, brain, nervous system, etc. So there are two, according to Aristotle, two types of potentiality, where an entity E has potentiality for P, for quality Q, in one of two ways. E can have Q in P1 potentiality. Having P1 potentiality means that E falls within the class of beings that have Q. This is to say that E has P1 because E is a being of a certain kind, or E's matter is such and such a kind. Or E can have a Q in P2 potentiality. Having P2 potentiality means E has P2 because E itself actually can actualize Q if E wants to, or if E is able to, probably better to say, and if nothing external prevents E from doing so. So these two senses of potentiality would apply to headless organism in the following way. The genetically altered organism would not have potentiality in the sense of P2. It would not itself be able to actualize the capacity of having a head, primarily because something external to it is preventing it from doing so. But this organism would have potentiality in the sense of P1. It still falls within the kind of things that have heads. Assuming you're cloning an organism with a head. You could be cloning a jellyfish or something. Headless jellyfish. Okay, so this would apply to humans or frogs in the case of the original article. The interesting thing here is the ontological dependency between these two types of potentiality, P1 and P2. P2 is ontologically dependent on P1, and then it cannot have potentialities that it is able to actualize by its own powers if it's not already the kind of thing that can actualize those potentialities. In one sense, P2 is a potentiality because the quality in question is had by the entity in question, but simply unactualized due to the entity's failure to actualize it. Maybe caused, foisted upon the entity to fail to actualize it. In another sense, P2 is an actuality of P1 potentiality had by E in virtue of its being a specific kind of thing. The kindedness or essence or soul is logically prior to all the potentialities and actualities. So even though our headless clone isn't able to actualize the capacities that come with the actualization of full-headedness, the clone still has P1, which necessarily has within it the potentiality for P2. It's interesting to note that Aristotle maintains that the body exists for the sake of the soul. He states all natural bodies are instruments for the soul, showing that they exist for the sake of the soul. Thus, the human body and all of its potential parts exist for the sake of the human soul. This strongly indicates that all bodily parts can be understood only in light of the soul, which is actually prior to the parts, and all of the parts exist for the sake of the realization of the whole. This can be applied to human genes. They exist as parts which are for the sake of the whole qua human soul. Even the genes of a human being are tools used by the human soul for the sake of actualizing the bodily potentialities latent in a human substance. So, how would Aristotle answer the question we started with? First, Aristotle would say, yes, human clones are actually human. They're full human beings that have one important bodily part that still actually exists in potential in the headless human itself, namely, the potential to form a head. Second, Aristotle would think that a headless human clone does in actuality have a complete human soul. The human, qua whole substance, came into existence with its full human form informing its constituent matter. The human soul then is actual and complete, even though one of its potentialities, a very important one for human beings, especially human happiness on Aristotle's view, if you want to read the Nicomachean Ethics, you can understand that, and complete, even though one of its actual potentialities has been prohibited from being actualized. Sorry, there was a bee. Okay, so the joys of being outdoors. I like being outdoors, but risk encounters with insects, bees in this case, not headless bees. Okay, so that's kind of a conclusion of the metaphysics of this question. My response from Aristotle is, yeah, human clones, headless or not, have souls, and I've tried to explain the metaphysics of that. And even a headless clone would still be a full human, fully human, full person, just with one of its parts unactualized. Okay, so now the question is kind of the ethical question: is should we have spare parts clones? This is something people are wrestling with right now. Maybe if somebody watches this another 20 or 30 years, maybe it'll be something you talk about with your friends. I was thinking about getting me a spare parts clone. What do you think? Okay. Well, is headless cloning virtuous? My answer is going to be no. Okay. But here's Aristotle's answer. I think the answer for Aristotle to the question of whether headless cloning would be virtuous would be a clear no. The main reason has to do with Aristotle's view of happiness. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that human happiness is rational activity of the soul that expresses virtue. A headless clone, on Aristotle's view, just can't be happy. Well, this clone is the kind of thing that could be happy. It's not happy, or he or she is not happy, because she can't actualize her latent capacities to be happy. Headless clone can't move ahead towards happiness because she can't actualize her head. If I want to be happy, I need rational activity. To do that, I need, at least while embodied, I need a brain and a head to hold the brain. If I don't have either one of those, I can't actualize my rational capacities. Therefore, on Aristotle's view, I can't be happy. But the question is, how did I get that way? How did, if I were a headless clone, how did this human being get into a state where I couldn't become happy? Well, someone put me into that state. Someone made me unhappy. So now that you have what you have is a person, a scientist, who is intentionally making someone else, a headless human clone, unhappy. So if happiness consists in doing the kind of scientific research for the purpose of creating headless clones, regardless of the reason for doing so, then happiness consists in creating unhappiness. The concept of happiness being or producing unhappiness is absurd. That's contradictory. So on an Aristotelian metaphysics and ethics, spare parts cloning is not virtuous because it creates human beings who cannot be happy. So you might think, well, yeah, this all depends on the plausibility of an Aristotelian metaphysics of soul. Well, there is a tight connection between Aristotle's ontology and his ethics, and I think a good one. One major objection to the ethical ramifications of this psychological ontology is that it is the ontology of the soul. It's not the ontology of the psyche, I mean the soul in the Aristotelian sense. Is that Aristotle's account of the soul is just false, someone might argue. It's inconsistent with, say, scientific biological naturalism, and even more broadly, philosophical naturalism. This is the view that all accounts of nature, of reality, including what it means to be human, are reducible to the category of the hard sciences, especially physics. It's very clear that Aristotle's account of the soul is inconsistent with naturalism in this sense, and so in order to defend Aristotle's view against this broad objection, one must give an account of the plausibility of Aristotle's view vis-a-vis his view of the soul vis-a-vis naturalism. I'm not going to be able to give an argument for the plausibility of Aristotle's view here, but I'd like to propose how one might answer this kind of objection against Aristotelian substance dualism from a naturalist point of view. Here's what has been proposed by a recent defender of a type of Aristotelian substance dualism. We can make three major phenomenal features of human existence and compare two ontological models in order to see which model best explains the evidence. Okay, so the objection I have in mind here comes from J.P. Moreland and Scott Ray in their book called Body and Soul. Okay, so this is the objection. So what we do is you set up two ontological models of the human soul and see which model has the most explanatory scope, right? Best explains the phenomena. It's an inference to the best explanation type of argument. Okay, here's the model. Consider these three bits of evidence. There's a unity of myself, my rational, putatively non-physical mental parts and bodily parts at a given time. 2, there's the unity of myself across time and change. And 3, there's apparent freedom of the will. So what I'm suggesting here is that a naturalistic physicalistic model and an Aristotelian substance dualist model should be constructed, and these two models should be compared in their explanatory power of accounting for these three phenomena of human life. And I think these are obvious features of common sense human life that everyone's experienced. I believe that the Aristotelian substance dualist model is the one that can make the most sense of these phenomena. Only if Aristotle's right can Aristotle's view be made plausible by serious moral inquiries, at least those fortunate enough to have a good head on their shoulders. All right, thanks for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom. You.